see this? Yes.
Yes.
Cool.
Yep.
All right. So yeah, I'm gonna jump right in. Many of you know me, but for those who don't, my name is Patrick Chandler. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, and wear many hats, including acting as the coordinator for the Clean Network and helping us out with scheduling calls and the network side of things. I'm going to introduce you today to some of the work I've been up to over the past year with my research partner, Emmanuel, who wanted to be here today, but was not able to make it to the call. So my background involved starting off in environmental ed and then moving into the issue of marine debris and pretty quickly finding that standard ways of communicating about it weren't working for me. I was presenting at the same conferences to the same groups year after year to get funding to go out, collect more debris, to go back to the same conferences year after year. And I started to see this cycle where it just wasn't reaching new audiences, wasn't moving the dial on the issue. And so I got involved with a group called the Wash to Shore Project and became their education director to focus on bringing in arts as part of the communication, awareness, and action building strategies. And I did that for a number of years, but kept bumping up against this question of from different venues and museums of like, oh, this project is great. Can we do this here? And my answer was no, you shouldn't do this here. You shouldn't take a project that's been created and replicated. You should bring together your own scientists, artists, educators, and community members to give voice to something that matters to your community and to move towards actions that matter here. But I didn't have anything to hand folks to say, and this is how you might go about that. And there are pieces of that puzzle in a lot of different places, but I really came to see you to focus on doing the background research to create that resource. And in this work, I met Emmanuel through the Office of Outreach and Engagement at CU, who I've been working with. And she was bumping up against the same thing. She had done some projects heavily focused in the science realm, but was an artist herself and moved into partnering with the arts and had a lot of requests to move that work forward, but didn't have something to extend to communities and organizations and partners who wanted to get projects going themselves. So last spring, we created this project to design this resource by doing a pretty extensive literature review. And then one of the blessings of COVID was that we were able to reach so many people around the country who were up to jump into a Zoom interview because, you know, they were working from home and had a minute to spare. So we interviewed an incredible group of folks. You can just glance at some of them here. You may recognize some of the names, but we wanted to take what we saw in the literature and what emerged as far as methods and approaches and lessons learned from all these interviewees to design these guidelines for art and science partnership. We really wanted to focus a resource on those folks who are facilitating projects. Of course, anybody can jump in and use this and take what they need from it, but we really saw this need for folks who were standing in the position of bringing partners together rather than fulfilling one role or the other. And we started to build these and think through the language. It's interesting in building the guidelines ended up following a lot of the lessons ourselves. And I had started to conceive of this as a co-designed framework for integrating art and science. And right away, one of our lessons from the literature in our interviews was really being thoughtful around language. And pretty quickly, the need to shift what this project was called came about, because thinking of this as a framework really pushed back on a lot of the art folks we were working with, who said, no, that is really too rigid for the types of projects we want to go about. We don't want a framework. We want a system of support that can help us create these partnerships. And then something I've noticed a lot over the past few years is when we talk about art and science partnerships, so often what that looks like in practice is science using the arts to communicate. And this idea of integrating art and science, the word integrating often denotes one thing being subsumed by another. And that's what I've seen a lot in the context of art and science, that it was how can we use art to communicate this idea that we have, rather than how can we build a partnership together. So we moved to calling this resource we're creating the Guidelines for Art and Science Partnership, which seemed to fit our purpose. And this is the graphic representation of what we've created, which is a pretty extensive guide that goes through all the resources we did in our literature review, and also a number of other web-based resources and guides to really provide support. Um, I'll post this link in the chat so you don't have to try and copy it down from the slide. But what we realized is that there needs to be something that we hold on to throughout this process. There's many steps, but there really needs to be a core of principles that we honor throughout. Many of these will seem like common sense, but they often get ignored within the context of partnerships, or just need to be refocused on again and again and again. One of the principles that I think is most important to mention is the place-based knowledge and action. And I think that that's probably the most commonly ignored. Um, Projects often get started with an idea about a problem that, climate is a great example. We have this problem of climate change. Let's talk about it. Let's raise awareness within the community. But often that doesn't come with, why does it matter here? What do we do here? What do pathways to action look like? So that was one of our most important guiding principles, even though they're all pretty vital to projects being successful. In the guidelines, we had 4 phases that emerged, and each of these phases have 3 stages. The most important thing to me that emerged as far as the process was focusing on the early work of sitting in a place of questioning, rather than jumping from we have an idea to what can we do for a project on it. Sitting really within that space of we have an idea. Okay, what does that idea mean in the context of community? Who does it matter to? What relationships do we already have that we might check in with about that idea? So the space of exploring is the first phase. And Marta Kern really came up with this great language of sharing a point of wonder as the start of a project. I love this so much, because it's the idea that you start with this question of, why is this thing like that? When I walk through this park, why don't I feel comfortable? When I see the banks of this river being filled with houses, why is that an issue? So it starts with these questions of I wonder about this. And then says, okay, so we have this question of wondering, and starts to bounce that against others in the community of like, well, who also might be wondering about this? Who also might be sitting in this place of curiosity on this topic? And then considering what what you have and possible partners might have to move forward on working on this issue. After this space of considering a point of wonder and looking at where things stand currently, bringing some partners together, the project orienting phase has to do with co-creation mainly. It says, okay, so you've got an issue, you have a point of wonder and a group of partners, but rather than saying, I'm creating this project, are you all on board? Creating a space where partners can sit around the table and say, what does this issue mean to you? When I bring up this idea, this point of wonder, how does it affect you? And allowing space for each partner to speak to that. Um, and bring their own thoughts and ideas about what action might look like around this point of wonder, so that by the time you move towards action, everybody feels heard and feels that their background and knowledge and expertise has been honored within the partnership group. In the creating phase of the project, and I think it's important to note that when you get to the creating phase, you're already halfway through. So much should take place before you get to the point where you're like, okay, let's build something, let's do something. And that pre-work is so vital. But in the creating phase, prototyping can look so many different ways. We had amazing conversations on what this looks like for artists, what this looks like for scientists, what it means to create a prototype that actually informs where you go next with a project, so that by the time you get to bringing the full project into the world, it's really well grounded and ready to go. This arena of creating also brings in some methods of formative assessment pretty often, and just recording these processes. So what did you learn from prototyping? If you were creating a play around this art science partnership and you had a small audience, what was their feedback and how do you bring that in? Um, this is the first phase where you probably are calling out to the community outside of your partner group and saying, we would like participants, we would like audience members. And it's kind of a delicate stage in doing that well to really communicate your intent for anybody who joins the project in this phase as a participant. This reflecting phase, I think, is one that really it creates some interesting uncomfortableness. It's a phase where I think some folks in the art realms and the nonprofit realms and some of the partners that we worked with and interviewed, it's not a place where they're comfortable for many reasons. And part of it, I think, is that when we talk about reflection and evaluation and assessment, I think that for many folks, that means a very particular way of going about things. It means, we're going to use a Likert scale. We're going to do pre and post interviews. We're going to go about things in a way that is pretty common in the scientific community, because in this realm, the scientific community is most often the group that has the privilege to actually do assessment, to actually take the time to look back at a project rather than move on to the next immediately. So in this reflecting phase, really talking with partners about reflection as a form of celebration, thinking about ways to do this that weren't purely analytical or quantitative, but allowed for partner groups to consider what reflection looks like as thick description, as just sitting together and talking through, how did that feel? What did we learn? What are our takeaways? What happened in this project? allowing for some of those different reflection methods can really call people in, and be pretty powerful. And also acknowledging that reflection has multiple levels, internal to the project partner groups, external to funders and community, and it can look very different for each one of those groups. So with those 4 project phases and core principles that emerged from that literature review, um, and the interviews, the other piece of it was really calling people and groups to consider these various realms of reflection. The first one being reflection with self and positionality, having each partner really think about who they are and what they're bringing and what that means to the project, and doing some work around that so that there's self-awareness around that positionality for each partner. The next was thinking about what real partnership work means. And that's tough because it involves things that in individual silos, in individual fields, there's so much that we take for granted. So to step outside that into these transdisciplinary partnership, it means really sitting with power and status and who is coming in with what levels of power and status and ego, and moving beyond that to a place where partners can honor each other's background and knowledge and expertise on equal levels, and not create a hierarchical system within the partnership that says, since I'm coming in with this background, I should have more say. So this realm of navigating partnership became a huge focus for the guidelines. This piece of relationship calls back to what I mentioned with place-based focused, and really thinking about how to transition from a way of looking at the natural world in terms of resources to moving to looking at it in terms of relationship, and asking, who are these places that we live and work within? Who who is that river? Who is that forest? And how do we see it that way instead of how can I use these places around me? This transition, I think, is a tough one, but can really bring projects into focus in place-based partnership. The last piece of the guidelines that comes up again and again, I think it's a challenge for all of us in so many of our partnerships, is time. It takes a minute to build these trusting relationships that these partnerships necessitate. And time is often used to hold power and status within the context of partnerships, saying certain partners do or do not have time to engage in these activities, or do or do not have time to sit around a table until everybody's been heard. So these 4 realms of relationship, with self, with others in the group, with the natural world, and time, became a center point for the guidelines. And finally, this is something that I have to remind myself over and over again in projects, because when I bear down and get to work, I'm like, okay, we're doing this. I so often forget to celebrate each step, the big steps and the small steps, and the joy of working together. So braiding that throughout these projects, for me, is a challenge, but is so deeply important to relationship. So those are the a little bit about the guidelines themselves. I know I was speaking in kind of a zoomed out abstract terms for a lot of it. Part of the point is to allow a flexible enough set of guidelines so that a lot of different types of projects can take this system and use it in a meaningful way. Again, I'll put the link to the full guidelines in the chat. And where we're at right now is we're in a strategic review phase, having a few folks dive in and give some feedback. But this spring, we also created a cohort to do a series of workshops to see how this came together in practice. So this involved University of Colorado PhD and postdoc students in the sciences who really wanted to learn how to work within the context of community and partner with the arts. So we had one cohort from CU and then a cohort of community members that represented artists and nonprofit leaders and folks in different organizations within the community of Boulder, Colorado. And we brought them together for a series of workshops that included an introduction that's not listed here, but each workshop focused on one of the phases of the guidelines. This was our kind of leadership team, but this involved a much bigger team than this. You can explore this project online. I'm just going to show you where to find it if you're curious. Just a moment. Okay. So the details on the workshops, the guidelines themselves, and a lot of info on this program are listed here on the Office of Outreach and Engagement website. But here you can find out more about the cohort members who were involved, about the co-leads, which included myself and Emmanuel, and then Lisa Schwartz from the Office of Outreach and Engagement, and Charlotte Lasoso from the Boulder County Arts Alliance, and then a set of advisors who helped us along throughout. So a lot of folks involved in this this workshop series this summer. But what I really wanted to put out there for discussion. Oh, one thing I wanted to share before I get to discussion questions. One of the most fun things on these workshops that I had not tried before, but tried for this, each workshop, they had a reading from the guidelines to do for that phase. And then we created 4 different types of reading reflections. The first one was writing thick description, a reaction to that reading. The second one was having a conversation with somebody about it and scribing that conversation. The third was a photographic reflection on the reading. And the fourth was an embodied reflection that involved how it made you feel and showing that to the group. And one of the most fun things of these workshops was that they had to do these 4 feedback methods, but they could choose which one they wanted to do in their own schedule. So for each meeting, we had share outs of all these 4 methods from different cohort members, and it created a really rich place for discussion around the guidelines. Glad to share the details of that activity if that's of interest. From these workshops, we got so many cool projects on topics that I had not ever really thought of. We had a couple astrophysicists who really wanted to talk about space junk, and I went, well, how are you going to ground that in place and make it applicable here? And they said, well, actually, there's so much space junk right now, it's preventing the launch of a lot of satellites that would expand rural internet access, which is an issue for Colorado. And I went, huh, whoa, that is not something that was on my radar at all. And so these projects that came out of the spring cohorts were really cool. But here's where I wanted to sit with y'all and think for a few minutes through the 2 big questions that came up for me. A big focus of the projects was how to get folks into this space of width. So acknowledging this spectrum that you can do work to a community, which is an extractive method where you say, I want to research this community, so I'm going to go in, take the information I need and publish my work. That can also be done on the art or nonprofit side of saying, I want to learn about this so I can do that, so I'm going to go and do it and leave. That is about as far from where we want to be with these guidelines as can be. But this middle space of for, doing work for a community, is a place a lot of folks are used to and a lot of folks land, where they say, we see this rural community over there. We really think they need to understand this information. They need to gain this awareness. They need to take these steps. So we're going to go in and do this presentation or this work for them in order to move them to the place where we think they ought to be. That is a really, really common place. And I think probably with great intention, it's where a lot of projects end up. The goal we're really going for is this width space. So instead of having a project say, we've got this great idea, we think your community needs it, we're going to go in and do it for you. Moving to a place where if we're going to do a presentation, a play, or an exhibit, or a piece of work in a community, it should be co-created with them. So if you are interested in working with them, talking to community representatives and groups and saying, does this issue matter to you? In what context? How can we connect with this topic in a way that actually might move local action in a meaningful way? So, you know, if it's resilience to climate change, for instance, instead of going in with, we created this presentation, we tested it where we were, then we went to your community and we assumed this is what you'd be concerned about, actually sitting with and saying, oh, there's a lot of farmers in your community. They might be concerned about these impacts of climate change. So we're going to include that in our presentation and in our work. We're going to have those conversations to raise and delve into the questions that are deeply meaningful and place-based. So I can delve more into that, but I really want to talk about the experiences y'all have had and the advice that you have of moving into this space of with community and how to help shift groups into that space of work rather than this to or for space. And the last thing I wanted just to mention, I want to put the link to the guidelines in the chat here so that you can delve into them. I probably should have done this earlier, so apologies there. Here's a link to the guidelines. And just wanted to show you the way they're structured with this, the graphic, the intro, a bit on who it's for, and facilitation, the structure, a bit on the guiding principles. But I wanted to show you that in each one of the phases, each stage has an overview and prompts that are questions groups can ask themselves within that stage, insights from our interviews, and resources related directly to that stage. So there's a lot in the guidelines. I encourage you to play with them and definitely would welcome any thoughts or advice you have if you delve into them and things come up. Okay, so that was a lot, talking with the talking through the guidelines, talking about the cohorts, and then this question of how to move into the with space. I could have paused more, but let's jump in. Any questions about any of those things, or ways to talk about that moving into the with space? Okay, I see Jim has a question. Is the scope of this essential project encompass all the major forms of art? Um, yes, and that is one of the reasons why it's kind of broad and not as specific in how to navigate these partnerships, because there's different forms of art sometimes do navigate or necessitate different different forms of engagement and techniques. So yeah, Jim, it is meant to be accessible to all forms of art, whether it's performing art or fine art. Something that we leaned on a lot in thinking through the different types of art was the aesthetics perspective framework from Animating Democracy. Um, I don't know if y'all are familiar, but I'll put that in the chat. And basically, the aesthetic perspectives framework um, says that we should think about aesthetics differently in terms of art and how it functions in society. And instead of saying that we should consider the specific aesthetics of Western fine art, we should broaden that to include uh, the value of art in these terms: disruption, commitment, communal meaning, cultural integrity, and they go into what it looks like to value art in these realms. And usually you choose just one to three of them to really focus on. But rather than focus on a specific type of art, we really wanted to focus on art that did a specific type of thing, namely meet one of these aesthetic criteria. And I will put that in the chat. There we go. Okay. Jim, did that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
For sure. Nancy, what's up?
Yeah, that was just fabulous, Patrick. And I'm glad you didn't pause. You kept the coherence and the motion going. It was very inspiring and very helpful. I'm going two places with it. If we create a pilot for ACE here that I've been calling PACE in the Central Coast, it applies beyond art. Obviously, this whole notion of getting deep with people as you come together to actually empower, to create climate empowerment, it absolutely has to start with the principles, the philosophy, and then laying out what the steps are, the approaches was just extraordinarily helpful. And I'm going to go back and make use of it and look forward to any further workshops that you may be doing and so forth. Every piece of it rang true. The other thing I wanted to just briefly share with you was an experience that I had decades ago that might be relevant to this question of working with. It was Boston. It was it was in the middle of the busing crisis that was supposed to be reintegrating schools racially. And in Boston at the time, in the neighborhoods I lived in, people were literally killing each other over these issues. And Judge Garrity had brought in a great deal of federal money and federal authority and ordered universities and ordered businesses to work with local school districts and created multicultural parent councils that were given quite a bit of authority to hire principals, spend money, and so forth. Only in our neighborhood, the parents could not come together because there was too much fear of going into each other's neighborhoods. And I was fortunate to have the opportunity as a recent graduate of the ed school to work with a community organizer. Carmen Polo was her name, with just extraordinary depth of experience, her own radio show, really knew what she was doing. And we were working for Boston University. And we met with each of the 4 different ethnic groups separately. We had deep conversations, we listened, we hung out, had drinks together, just did all the relationship building and listening, and basically said, we have been hired to to quote, do an educational program. And we said, this is your program, the university is your resource. What do you feel you need to know? By the way, you actually have authority to spend government money. So what would you like to know in spending it? And how would you like to make use of the university? And ended up with the panels coming in from the university with expertise to answer questions around a curriculum the community had created. And it took a while for them the community to agree on it. And they got to speak for 5 minutes and everything got translated. And then they had to come and sit down at the tables and have conversations with people at tables. And the translation went on simultaneously between bilingual parents and monolingual parents. And it ended up being the most successful program in the city of Boston out of 9 of them. And very much trusted. And then it was ended overnight because, as I was told, we hired you to do community education, not community organizing. And what was happening was our parents were starting to, and the very committed principals, to show up downtown in a very corrupt system and start demanding what was really needed for their kids. But it has stayed in my mind over the years as a sense of, came to be a sense of genuine partnership in which the university experts learned a very great deal from the community leadership they were working with.
I think there's great potential for programs like that. And one of the big steps that I've seen is the willingness from the university to stop othering community.
Yes.
You know, when I first got into community-based research, one of the words that came up as a triggering word in the discussion we were having was community. And I was like, whoa, how is that a trigger? And it was explained to me so often it's used in the university talk of like, the community is over there and they understand these things and get these things. And we, the university, are over here and do things this way, without seeing that the university was part of the community they resided within. So I think that there's great potential for work like that. It just kind of takes a willing group of partners who are actually able to sit within that power and status situation, and allow themselves to be equals.
I think our culture, if I may say, will soon turn 80, and I've had the privilege of watching it evolve. And you, if I may say, and your generations have so much deeper understanding of these things. You may fall far short of your own ideals, but wow, you really have a sense of where it is we need to go and how to do it. And I'm truly grateful.
Nancy. Eric, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just picking up where Nancy kind of, thanks for sharing that. I think the word that really resonates with me is the idea of listening. I mean, and I would call it authentic and active listening, which includes acknowledgement of the past and what folks have brought to the table. A couple examples come to mind. I mean, all the DEIA work to me is really about unpacking stories and understanding each other's backgrounds at a much deeper level, and with appreciation for where we're all coming from. And, you know, for example, what Native Americans brought to forest management in California, just acknowledging those practices, and that we use those to actually mitigate, you know, fire in an emerging crisis for California and the West. So, you know, there's so much past that we need to acknowledge. And then one of the approaches, you know, with the conference, Cheney, that was awesome last week that I took, and it gave me a new opportunity to try a new approach with delivering on a climate program, was to really ask questions first, almost like just to sort of say, what are your main concerns going into a discussion? And this was something I learned during the Climate Reality Project, was to really understand your audience, to sort of do some research, to really recognize where they're coming from, And if you can, and you have the means, do sort of a sort of what concerns you. So the on the ground example of this was, I asked students in New York, what were their concerns around climate change as teenagers in New York, and they, populated sort of a spreadsheet. We had like 100 different plus data points and pieces of feedback from the students, and I took that information and built my presentation around, centered it around their concerns, not around so it's not a for, like you're saying, Patrick, it's a with approach. Another example I would say is kind of related to Nancy, what you were sharing. When I worked at Chabot Space and Science Center, we would actively partner with community groups like Boys and Girls Clubs and libraries. And we really were trying to get to a model where it was co-creating the program, recognizing that the Boys and Girls Clubs leaders within Oakland know those kids way better than we do at Chabot. They have experience, they have a relationship with those students that we need to listen to and understand, and not come in and say, we're going to do a bunch of science with your kids because they need that. It's what type of science resonates with them? How do we work with them from a place that they feel empowered and sort of. And then the last example I would bring would be this idea that there is best practice out there all over the place that we need to tap into, right? So urban gardening as a solution, for climate change and CO2 mitigation and, reducing, and just the whole thing. There's folks doing that all over the world within very diverse communities, and that knowledge and information can inform how we move forward. And it's very place-based. It's very active. We all need food. We all need to sort of move ourselves forward. So I'm really trying to sort of move, and this kind of comes back to Art, your idea about positivity and solution-based. People are doing stuff around the planet right now. There's so many case studies and so many instances of people taking positive action. We just need to unpack those and show and bring those, uplift all of those stories, because that's what the youth want to see. They want to see, like, what can I do? How can I get my hands dirty? How can I make a difference? And so that's kind of the transition I'm personally trying to make in my own work with different communities, is that active piece, that listening and uplifting and finding those places where there's really good work happening throughout, the world, essentially. So thanks so much for the presentation. I really appreciate that. And just to kind of summarize this idea, it's not for, it's with. And I think that's an awesome approach.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, just one quick thing on that. I want to jump to Tiffany and then Jim and back to Nancy, but I think what really came out to us is that so many of these practices, so many of the steps needed for partnership are so universal when it comes to any type of partnership. And there are some specifics in terms of the art science works as far as considering aesthetics and some concerns around how to navigate those spaces. But at the core, it is about partnership, it's about listening, and it's about moving beyond hierarchical structures of relationship with both people and places. All right, Tiffany, you jump in?
Yeah, sure. So thanks so much, Patrick, for sharing that. And you had shared that model, guiding principles, sorry, not model, with me earlier in the middle of our mural project that we're doing. So I just, as a lifelong educator, I see so many parallels with good educational pedagogy, right? With the gradual release of responsibility and how, good teaching is always about guided practice and collaborative practice that leads students to being able to co-own the learning, right? And the idea of with is that powerful thing of learning alongside and working together. One of the things that Jessica Bean and Katie Boyd and I are working on right now is kind of what these different constellations of support look like for teachers. I've both participated in and delivered lots and lots and lots of professional development for teachers. And I think we need to really rethink professional development for teachers with this same lens, right? Because, you know, the sage on the stage, if you're a teacher in front of kids or if you're a teacher in front of teachers, it doesn't work, right? So it's this whole idea of the deep listening and coming together as scientists, as community volunteers, as you know, organizations that are working to support educators, that support kids, that support the climate, that support whatever the cause is, that support, so that it's everyone coming together instead of, I think a lot of traditional professional development is here, let's just download all this stuff onto teachers instead of coming and doing it with teachers and with the students and communities, like you said, identifying the local phenomenon and the local sustainability goals or the local, you know, what needs to happen to come together. And a lot of what you were saying about positionality and power, right, is contradictory to the way a lot of people teach, right? It's like, here, I have these ideas for you, instead of let's do it with and in this constellation of support. So yeah, thank you for those great guiding principles. And I think they're have universal applications. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. You know, I was actually.
Oh, one quick side thing I just had to share. So the UMC roof where all the green people were, that's where we had our wedding reception. We got married in Old Main and had our reception on that roof. So I just had to share that.
Awesome. Yeah. You know, something that applies specifically in the educational realm that came up for me just last week when I was advising one of our project teams on how to navigate their idea of embodied work in the classroom, which is something I've done quite a bit of, was pausing to address the fact that there's a lot of safety associated with these hierarchies, especially in education. So that you have a model of the sage on the stage, I like that terminology, of a teacher in front of the classroom pontificating on a subject and students in their desk. And that is a very safe model for the teacher. It's a comforting space of like, I can be here, I have control in the classroom, I've got this. And when you start to break out and do things like bring in art or bring in this power leveling techniques that change that model, it is no longer a safe space for many educators. So starting with addressing that of like, hey, we need to do this. This is important. This will facilitate better learning. But first, we need to acknowledge how to feel like you're not losing something by changing the hierarchy and that you're still able to function as an educator in a place of respect and you know, the ability to manage a classroom without having to control a classroom. So it's a really interesting transition, specifically in the educational realm. Jim, I saw your hand go up a while ago.
Yeah, I just like to reflect. This is an excellent framework and excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think looking at the individual steps, I'm most intrigued by the very last one, what's next? And very often we get hung up as we devote a lot of energy to the other steps to, you know, almost think of this as an afterthought. And I would suggest that what's next has helped us by integrating that into the whole project so that we have a way or a means where some of the scientists and the artists that we collaborate with that bring up, you know, new ideas and new topics have a place to go with those, even if they don't fit exactly into what the consensus sketches the project to be. And we do multimedia projects and exhibits, gallery exhibits and small exhibits in libraries. We do planetarium shows. We work with K-12 teachers and their students and involve them in our projects. We do a lot of elaborate things, but we built that structure and a group of 30 scientists and artists by keeping in mind that there will be a next project. The topic may be different, but the schema and how we work together will remain. And our audience, of course, we try to ever expand, but we don't want to lose anybody either. And so it is a growing community within our community or in the other places. So excellent, Patrick, and I enjoyed this, and I will use much of what you have to say.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that comment of weaving in what's next throughout. Would love to talk with you sometime more about what you've been up to as well. And I know we're at time and we've 3 minutes over, but Nancy, I want to allow space for you, and then folks need to jump off, cool, but if you want to hang for a second, yeah, please do. Nancy.
Thanks. Just a quick comment picking up on Havel's earlier comment about local, place-based doesn't mean insular. Place-based has to be connected. So that next level of how do you connect laterally and vertically up and down the scale in ways that preserve and enhance the values that you're talking about. I would love to for us to have conversations about that. And I think Tiffany addressed some of that in her comments.
Definitely. Well, thank you. And I agree. It's this continued tension in the world of climate and the world of partnership, how you really manage to do excellent local focused work that is scalable. So I'd love to talk more about that. Maybe we can jump into some of that this fall. I'm going to stop the recording.